Sarah Ferguson did the one thing everyone in her position was supposed to do about Jeffrey Epstein. She cut him off, publicly, loudly. Years ago, she stood up and called ever associating with him a gigantic error of judgment. She apologized. She distanced herself. She said all the right words in the right order to the right cameras. Case closed. Reputation salvaged. The Duchess of York had drawn her line, and the world moved on. And then, in 2025, an email surfaced, a message she had reportedly sent to Epstein himself privately after all of those public denunciations, in which she called him, and I want you to hear the exact words, a supreme friend. Supreme friend, not to a journalist, not for a headline, to him, in private. After telling the entire world she had walked away. And the second that email appeared, the story stopped being about Epstein at all. It became about the apology. Because think about what that word does. If you're privately calling a man your supreme friend while publicly disowning him, then the public disowning was never real. The renunciation was a performance. She didn't just have an Epstein problem anymore. She had proof, in her own reported words, that her sorry for it was a costume. And what happened to her in the days after that email surfaced, the charities, the patronages, all of them at once, is one of the fastest public unravelings the royal orbit has ever seen. We're going to count them, every single one, but not yet, because to understand why one line in one email could do this, you have to understand what she built her whole comeback on first. Let's start with what she built. Because Sarah Ferguson's entire second act rested on a single, simple story. The story was, I made a terrible mistake, I recognized it, and I cut Jeffrey Epstein off completely. That was the foundation. Everything she rebuilt after, the children's books, the daytime TV warmth, the charity roles, the slow climb back into public affection, all of it stood on top of that one promise. She had learned, she had changed, she was done with him. Now watch what the Supreme Friend email does to that foundation. It doesn't just add an awkward detail, it pulls the bottom brick out, because the email, by its reported dating, sits on the wrong side of her public break. She'd already stood up and renounced him, and then, privately, she reached back toward the very man she'd sworn she was finished with, and flattered him. And here's the trap, and it's a trap she built herself. Someone who never made a big public show of cutting Epstein off could send a warm private note, and it's just bad judgment, nothing more. But Sarah Ferguson didn't do that. She staked her whole rehabilitation on the loud, on-the-record renunciation. She made the denunciation the centerpiece, which means the louder she was in public, the more damning that private supreme friend became. Her own apology is the thing that turned the email into a weapon. She handed the world the yardstick, and then the email failed to measure up to it. And that's a strange, cruel kind of self-sabotage when you slow it down. Most people get caught because they lied. She got caught because of the gap, the distance between the public statement and the private one. If she'd said nothing publicly, there's no gap to catch her in. If she'd been consistent, warm to him in private and honest about it in public, there's no gap either. It's the contradiction itself that's fatal. The apology and the email can't both be sincere, and she's the one who made sure both of them existed, in writing, on the record, pointing at each other. So now we've got a genuine problem, and I want you to actually sit inside it with me, because there's no comfortable way out. There are only two doors out of this room, and I want you to pick one in your head as I lay them out, because whichever you pick tells you something about how you read this whole family. Door number one, the kind door, sort of. The email wasn't real affection at all, it was fear. Picture it this way. Epstein at one point reportedly threatened her, and this was a frightened woman trying to placate a dangerous, litigious man. Calling him a supreme friend wasn't friendship, it was groveling. Damage control of a different kind, flattering the man she was scared of to keep him calm. Walk through door one, and her public denunciation might have been completely sincere. The problem is she never told us about the private grovel. So the supreme friend line becomes cowardice, not devotion. Door number two. The email was honest. It reflected how she actually felt. and the public denunciation was the show. Walk through this door, and the whole rehabilitation was staged from the beginning. The apology was a lie. The private warmth was the truth. She said one thing to us and meant another to him. Frightened placation or staged renunciation. And here's the thing. Look at what both doors have in common. Either she was lying to him or she was lying to us. There's no third door where she comes out clean and consistent. Because in every version, the public Fergie and the private Fergie don't match. One of them was an act. So tell me right now, in the comments, door 1 or door 2. Was the Supreme Friend email a scared woman placating a monster, or was it the real her, and the apology was the performance? I read these, and I promise you this one's going to split people right down the middle. Now let's talk about what it actually cost her, because it's tempting to file this under gossip, another royal, another embarrassing note. It wasn't gossip. It was a demolition, and it happened at a speed that's genuinely hard to believe. Almost the moment that email emerged, the phone calls started going the other way. Charities and organizations that had proudly attached her name to their work began cutting ties. One dropped her as a patron, then another, then another. Roles as ambassador, as figurehead, as the friendly royal face on the letterhead, reportedly severed, one after the next, in a matter of days. Not weeks, days. And understand what was being torn down here. This wasn't some idle title collection. This was the actual scaffolding of her comeback. The children's hospice work, the women's causes, the charitable portfolio she had painstakingly used to climb back to respectability. That was the machinery of her redemption, and it started shedding parts in real time, live, while the country watched. And these weren't small, anonymous roles she could quietly let go. Some of them were causes she'd been publicly, visibly attached to for years. The ones she'd talk about in interviews, the ones that softened her image and reminded people she was more than a tabloid punchline. Losing those isn't a footnote. It's the load-bearing wall of the whole comeback coming out. The professional stake was everything. Everything she'd spent years reconstructing. A public life built entirely on the premise that she had learned her lesson about Epstein, dismantled, brick by evidence that the lesson had been a performance. And it didn't land in a vacuum. It landed right in the middle of the wider Andrew and Epstein collapse. So as her ex-husband's world was caving in, hers caved in beside it. The whole York household dragged down together in the same news cycle, sharing the same fall. Okay, this is the moment I promised you at the very start. Let's open the vault. Let's count them. Because here's the knockout, and it isn't the wording of the email. It's what triggered the email. In the days after that message surfaced, organization after organization publicly walked away from Sarah Ferguson. A children's cancer charity, a hospice, support groups, causes she had been the face of. One by one, in a rapid, visible, one after another withdrawal that read, and I'm choosing this word carefully, like an institution being deserted in real time. Like watching people file out of a building and the last one turns off the lights. And that's the part that actually matters. Not the phrase in the email, the speed and the unanimity of the abandonment it caused. Because when one charity drops you, that's a decision. When 6 or 7 drop you inside the same handful of days, that's not a series of decisions anymore. That's a verdict. They all read the same email. They all held it up against her public apologies. And they all, independently, reached the identical conclusion. The apologies can't be trusted, so we can't be near her. And think about who these organizations actually are for a second, because it matters. These aren't corporations chasing a share price. These are charities, hospices, children's causes, groups built around the most vulnerable people there are. Their entire currency is public trust. Being associated with the wrong name doesn't just embarrass them, it threatens the donations that keep their doors open. So when many of them decide, all at once, that the reputational risk of keeping Sarah Ferguson is worse than the awkwardness of publicly dropping her, that tells you exactly how they weighed the email against the apology. They didn't wait for a court. They didn't wait for a statement. They read it themselves and moved, because standing still next to her had suddenly become the dangerous option. The exodus was the verdict. She never sat in a courtroom over this. She didn't need to. The Charities delivered the judgment for the public, and they delivered it by leaving. Count them, and the tally does all the talking. Every logo that quietly disappeared from her associations was another organization saying out loud, without saying anything, "We believed the apology, we saw the email, and we no longer believe the apology." Quick thing, and only because we're right at the hinge of the whole story. If you want the rest of these royal threads pulled straight, with the receipts, no fairy tales, do me a favor and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. That's it. Back to it, because the email wasn't a one-off. It fits a pattern that's followed Sarah Ferguson her entire adult life. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. The pattern is this: a financial or social entanglement with a wealthy, dubious figure, then exposure, then public contrition, then another entanglement, round and round. Go back through the decades, the tabloid humiliations, the famous cash for access sting years ago, where she was secretly filmed appearing to offer access to Andrew in exchange for money, caught on tape, apologized, moved on. The recurring, well-documented money troubles that keep pulling her toward rich benefactors like gravity. The Epstein email fits that mold exactly. Proximity to a dangerous man's money and orbit, maintained privately even after the public disavowal. That's the shape of it every single time. And it's worth remembering there was reportedly money in the Epstein orbit too, the kind of financial connection that has always been her particular weakness. The rich benefactor appears, the debts loom, the distance she swore she'd keep quietly closes again. The flaw isn't one bad email. One email you could forgive. The flaw is a repeated, lifelong willingness to stay quietly close to the very people she has loudly, publicly distanced herself from, whenever that closeness happens to serve her. Public distance, private proximity, over and over. The email is just the clearest photograph we've ever gotten of the habit. Now, to be fair, and I do want to be fair here, there's a real defense on her side, and it's leaned on for a reason. It's the vulnerability defense. A woman under relentless financial pressure, hounded and mocked by the press for the better part of 40 years, doing her flawed best to rebuild a life, deserving, like anyone, of a second chance. And honestly, some of that is legitimate. Say it plainly, she has been genuinely mocked, genuinely pressured, genuinely turned into a punchline for decades in a way that was often cruel and often unfair. That sympathy isn't nothing. But the Supreme Friend email is exactly where that appeal breaks. Because the whole vulnerability case asks the public to believe in a reformed, sincere woman who's earned her comeback. And the email reveals that the second chances were built on a version of events that wasn't true. You cannot ask people to believe in your reformed sincerity when a private message shows the reform was a public-facing outfit you took off the moment the cameras left. The appeal for compassion needs honesty underneath it, holding it up, and the email pulled the honesty out. What's left is the request for sympathy, standing on nothing. Which brings us to the heart of the whole thing, the moral of it. And I'm going to say it flatly because it deserves to be said flatly. Sarah Ferguson's entire comeback was built on one message to the world. I made a terrible mistake with Epstein, and I have cut him off. That was the deal she offered the public in exchange for a second chance. And a private email calling that same man a supreme friend, reportedly sent after that message, that email is the mistake of standing up and making a liar of the apology. That's the hypocrisy. And look closely at the structure of it because it's almost architectural. It's two-faced in the most literal sense. the public renunciation and the private flattery existing at the same time, each one canceling the other out. She didn't fail to apologize. That's the thing people get wrong. She apologized beautifully, in public, and then, in private, she befriended the man anyway, and she got caught holding both at once, one in each hand, and there is no way to hold both of those things and call yourself honest. So where does that leave her? Let's walk through the room and count who's still standing beside her, because that number tells the real story. And the room emptied fast. The Charities, gone. The patronages, gone. The ambassador roles, gone. The entire institutional structure of her comeback stripped away in a matter of days. Tied to Andrew, whose own collapse was deepening in that exact same window, so the York household became a kind of shared exile, the two of them marooned together on an island that used to be a mansion. And here's the detail that gives it a particular sting. This isolation wasn't handed to her by enemies. It wasn't the tabloids that finished her, and it wasn't Epstein's other associates, and it wasn't some rival at court. It was confirmed by the Charities themselves. The causes she had aligned with specifically to redeem herself, the people who were most invested in believing her, the ones who had bet their own good name on her sincerity, they were the first out the door. When your own character witnesses stand up and resign, one after another, that's a loneliness you can't argue your way out of, because the people best positioned to defend you just told the world they can't. And there's nobody left to make the case for you, because the people whose job it effectively was to vouch for your good character are the exact ones who quit. And here's the part she can never undo. The email exists. It can't be unsent. Those reported words are attached to her name now, permanently, sitting right there beside the apology they contradict. The gigantic error of judgment on one side, the supreme friend on the other, forever within reach of each other. The Charities that walked aren't coming back on the old terms. There's no version of this where she simply rebuilds the same portfolio the same way, because the premise the whole thing stood on has been publicly disproven. But here's the part that genuinely stays with me, the unsolved part, because we don't actually know how much more of that private correspondence exists. One email surfaced, one, and it was enough to trigger the entire cascade we just counted. So the question that hangs over all of it isn't really about the line we've already seen. The real question is whether that email was the whole of it, or just the first page we happened to get. Because if one reported message could do this much, could empty this many rooms this fast, then what does the rest of it say, if there's a rest of it? What's still sitting in correspondence nobody's read out loud yet? So here's what I want from you down in the comments. Fergie says she cut Epstein off, and maybe she believed her own public words the day she said them. I'll leave that door open. But privately, after the apology, she reportedly called him a supreme friend. So tell me, was the apology the lie, or was the email the lie? And is there any honest version of this story where somehow both of them were true at the same time? And if you want the next thread pulled, the one that runs straight into the middle of the York household, into Andrew's mansion, into the alibi nobody on earth has ever been able to verify, and into the files that keep leaking one page at a time, that one's waiting for you right here. I'll see you in it.